Reserve. The root of all our evil, it begins with the Federal Reserve. Hey, yeah, well, let's go back in time when everybody was so proud of a man.
I'm Tommy Salmons. This is Year Zero. Today, LB Muniz is on the show. We talk ESG and DEI, get into the details of that and how we view that and how we think it's affecting everything moving forward. But before I go any further, I'd like to thank everybody who's helping out with donations for me and the dental surgery I'm going to have. I really do appreciate that. Y'all have been just a blessing to me, and I know I'm not quite at the 5,600 that I need to get everything done, but you know, this damn dog can tear anything up if he puts his mind to it, and he decided he had it in his head that he was going to tear up my face, and so he did. Luckily it's not overly serious, but I still need to get this fixed because it has caused a couple of infections in my mouth and some different issues that I've had to deal with. So I really do appreciate everybody that's donated through my PayPal and Cash App, and I can't thank y'all enough. You're a true blessing in my life, and I'm glad I can do this for y'all as far as putting out podcasts, and I really appreciate everything y'all do. And sticking with me through all the awkwardness of me learning to be a podcaster. So RyanBunting.com for all of your graphic design needs. Go to RyanBunting.com. Ryan Bunting thinks he's a libertarian and an anarcho-capitalist. He's really just a fucking racist. And if you have any graphic design that needs that extra racial touch, go to RyanBunting.com. RyanBunting.com, putting blackface on Joe Biden. RyanBunting.com. Thank you, Tom Burton, for the music. Enjoy the show. All right. I am here with my boy, LB Muniz. What's going on, dude?
Tommy, happy to be back with you.
Yes, it's always fun to talk to you, even though I do give you a hard time sometimes. But that's just because you're
most of the time, but I understand.
It's because you're young. You gotta thicken that skin up, man.
That's fair. Hey, listen, I'm actually down a few pounds, so I mean, I guess maybe I just need to put back on in a different way.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about ESG, man, because you seem to have like more of a business mind than I do, and so your perspective, I think, is going to be interesting on this. So I'll kind of like give you like just a short summary of the way I look at it, and then we'll like just break into it and converse from there. All right. So when I started looking at this, the first thing that like clicked a bell with me was they're no longer going to send the police to your house to get you to comply. They're going to attack your finances. And it doesn't matter your income level, whether you're a welfare mom or a blue collar guy or a CEO. It's all about controlling the population through the financial system. And so they'll cut off certain aspects of your income, certain aspects of your credit, and this, that, and the other, depending on how you comply to these standards, or how you're investing, or how you're purchasing. And when I saw Bank of America hand over bank records to the FBI after January 6th, I was like, oh shit. Like that was a big moment. Then I saw the trucker convoy, which, me being a trucker, I was paying attention to what they were doing. Plus I had friends. I have a really good friend of mine who's from Canada, lives in New York, but he was going back and forth and be involved with the convoy. So I was really paying attention to what was happening with that. And then I saw them start freezing bank accounts. And I was like, this is that ESG shit. like it's all the same. It's coming from the same place, right?
Mhm.
And so that became my focus, and the way I talked about it was from that perspective of you're a you're working 10 hours, 12 hours a day, blue collar guy, enjoying your overtime, doing the best you can to take care of your family. And here comes the government saying, well, your habits are not permissible. We don't approve of the way you live your life. We don't approve of where you live or what you're investing in, your 401k. We don't approve of this. So therefore, we're going to penalize you, and we're going to make it more difficult on your family to survive and to thrive and to set up any kind of legacy that you may leave to your children. So that was really like my focal point. But you come at it from a little bit of a different angle. So let's like dive into your thought process on this.
Yeah, so I think the part of the conversation that we had on Lions of Liberty a couple of weeks ago, which is kind of spawning this conversation, was I tend to look at it being interested in philosophy and economics, but I tend to look at also like the moral and ethical ramifications of actions, and I'm always been very interested in culture. And like, what is this thing we call culture? How does it manifest in the real world? And, every single corporation out there talks about a corporate culture, right? This is how we behave within this institution. So we see these, we've all watched these initiatives. Some people have lived them in real time, being on the inside of these big organizations, but we're seeing it expand outward, right? It started in these sorts of norms and practices started in the highest of the highs, right? The finance markets and the tech world is really where we started to see this ideology promulgate in a corporate sense of things. I'm sure your audience is familiar with the roots of things like critical theory and of course Marxism, right? Mm-hmm. But also and the Frankfurt School. And so we know that this has been an operation that people have been, working towards for well over a century. Right. Let's just lay the groundwork there. And it has morphed and it has taken different forms. Today we kind of call it in a general cultural sense, like the woke, right? That's probably the most popular term. But then we can look at specific documents and initiatives that are put together. ESG scores are one of these. What I've tended to look at a lot are the diversity, the DEI or DIE measures, right? Diversity, inclusivity, equity. So diversity, equity, inclusivity. I have also remarked at multiple points, because I think it's one of those serendipitous accidents that I think is too hard to ignore, right? So we see the acronym, and Jordan Peterson, when he kind of was pointing the finger at some of these initiatives in the university systems, which is another area that we saw them kind of cannibalize, if you will. He talked about it in terms of die, right? And this is a death cult as a result. And like, oh, well, we can't be talking about these things in terms of DIE. That's a horrible acronym, and everybody knows Americans love acronyms. So we have to change that to something else. So what is it going to be? Well, it can't be IDE. That doesn't even make any sense. So we're going to go with DEI. Well, if you know your Latin, right? Like Dei is a word that we have for, and Deus, but like Dei is a word we have for God. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's an accident that most of these corporations are putting diversity, equity, and inclusion measures at the center of their corporate culture. And when now you might say, who cares? It's a faceless corporation. Well, yeah, that's true. That actually kind of is why it matters, the moral structure that's being taken into account, right? That's the mistake. That's the mistake of the purely the pure economic focus that a lot of people will take to things. Is like, they accidentally or purposefully fall into the trap of Homo economicus that Adam Smith created to try and understand the value, to try and determine value, right? So we had to create this person, and we tend to look at corporations the same way. Well, my hypothesis is that one of the reasons for the polarized world that we live in currently is that the moral center has been split pretty well resoundedly at this point, and more people are kind of starting to notice that, and starting to notice that this is the case. They just don't have the words for it. And what we see is, on one side are people committed to these frankly we might say these ideas of diversity, equity, inclusion, right? This apotheosis of the liberal ethos, in a sense. And then on the other side, I would argue, just to make a quick binary while we're talking here, I think you see people who are, generally speaking, theists. So people who believe in a God, whether that be the God of Abraham, or you might include some of our Indian, our Hindu friends in this, and certainly in some respects even Muslim and Buddhist as well. But I don't know as much about the East, so I'm kind of trying to draw this big picture to say that this is the battle at hand now. And then I think it's one of those things. It being the apotheosis of liberalism means that it is because of its atheism, right? And the problem with atheism is that you're denying a basic fact about human existence. And I do think people have realized that, especially people at the top who have billions of dollars to spend reading and to pay people to do research on human behavior. So this is all a long way of saying you have to give people something to believe in. And a lot of people are being taught from very young ages in the educational system, and then having it reinforced in the corporate system, that this cult of diversity, equity, and inclusion is the moral center of society going forward. And we can maybe unpack a little bit of that as we go.
Yeah,
and
that's what I was just doing. I was trying to find a pen because I wanted to write down a couple of things, because I want to make sure that we touch on a few points that you brought up there, because there's a lot there. There's a lot in what you said, but I got two main themes I want to kind of branch off of in what you were talking about. So the first thing I want to say, it's something that I've been really focused on, is you bring up the corporations centering the diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, I look at diversity, equity, and inclusion as just a part of ESG, as just a limb. And that's just because it seems to me like what they did is they took all these kind of woke ideals, like climate change and diversity, equity, inclusion, and all this stuff, the vax cards and all this stuff, all this shit that has been going on for years. They just kind of took it and they just compacted it into ESG, and it's this is your social credit score system. This is the system we're going to use to score you, and it branches. And I mean, I have a chart. I should have sent it to you, I guess. I have a chart that I pulled off of one of their pages where it tells you, it lists under the E, the S, the G, all the different aspects of that, bullet point. And so the first thing I want to touch on, do you think that there's a true belief in the corporate structure that this is what they need to do? Because the way it looks to me, the way I've been observing it, the way I've been intaking it, is that the corporations are only acting in this way because the SEC put pressure on the financial institutions not to give out loans, not to financially benefit anyone who wasn't going along. So how do you tell which corporations are going along to get along and which corporations are true believers in this situation? Because it seems to me the key to all of this is the financial institutions. And there's that old, I think it was Baron de Rothschild quote, "I care not who makes the laws as long as I control the currency." Right. So I think it was Baron. I could be wrong on the name. So I've put a lot more emphasis on the financial institutions and using them as the enforcement arm of the United States government. But you seem to be a little bit more focused on the corporations. So I'm wondering, am I missing something? Are there true believers in the corporate structure that you're witnessing, or does it boil down to the access to loans and credit?
Right. No, I think you point out one of the key radiating points of this, which are the financial markets. if and financial institutions.
Okay.
Because I mean, I don't think it's wrong that that's where people that I like, you follow the money, right? That's the thing, that if you follow the money, you can pretty much figure out why most things are happening the way they are. And to your point, right, the whole idea, as far as I understand it, of why ESG needed to be created and like and moreover implemented, had to do with the fact that under a natural, as overly regulated as you want to say the American market is or is not, the natural course of a business is to try and make money. And the more they can do to make money, that's going to be avenues that they explore, right? It's
right.
And so too individuals, right? And this, this whole, one thing that's been interesting over the last few years is just re-examining this whole idea of corporate personhood, from a more philosophical angle, and just kind of seeing how, in a very real, I mean, we literally, and by we, I just mean like the collective human, ether, a mind or whatever. Like we created, we want things to be people so bad. We loved it when Wendy's Twitter started going after Burger King. Right? Like like these corporations will literally try to create a voice for themselves, and not just a voice in the sense of these are the services and products we're offering, but we want to offer you a whole, the whole package, everything, including ethical and moral ideals that we're being told people care about.
Oh, and what was the chicken sandwich debate? Was that Popeyes and Chick-fil-A or?
Yeah. And and so some of that is just driving buzz, right? Like you can kind of do with that, but I'm trying to point a little bit deeper and say, like, yeah, isn't it kind of weird that we expect a corporation to be like a customer service person and that they have a Twitter profile like a regular person does, and they can have, they can say thoughts and things like a regular person. Anyway, it's a slight non sequitur in a way, but to the question.
Yeah, but it's a sleight of hand on their part, though, because you're interacting with the corporation, but you're not interacting with them as you would as a customer with a corporation, right? Mm-hmm. So they're advertising to you without without you realizing you're being advertised to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so from that, we can kind of understand that there are forces at work beyond what we might be able to comprehend, or even what the people who are participating in have even thought about. So whether, so just to the point is, again, I'm going to go back. I don't think you're not wrong to talk about the financial markets in terms of corporate, but that's not enough, right? And in fact, it's been one of the last pillars to fall, we might say. And it's one of the ones, and it's going to cause an acceleration because of it, right? First, we saw this ideology complete. And one more thought I want to put into people's heads, and maybe we can unpack it, is this question I had once. I don't know, you can go back and listen to my show. I think I said it somewhere in the early episodes. But like, if you wanted to reverse engineer a religion, what would you do? Well, I think you kind of just pointed towards that a little bit before when you said, like, this modern woke thing is just taking all the major talking points from left-wing sources, and we're rolling it into this one thing that we, that people call being progressive, or their opponents call being woke, because it's subsumed all of these ideas unto itself. And then they've been told that this is the highest virtue that you can show as an individual, right? That's what if you go to college, which most of these major corporations recruit from the colleges, right? As they will continue to do. And, the whole college itself being a finishing school for the elite, right? So it's always the idea of finishing. It always has this idea of inculcating an ideology into people, right? And so for the longest time, people have just been spoon-fed, this generic Marxist-laden leftism, this broad leftism that's also been then more modernized in terms of critical race theory, queer studies, and what would be another one to point to? Women's studies as well would be one of the three vectors of approach. And
yeah, the pink hair fist raising people. Yeah, I know those. I know them. The zombies.
Right. And so you can look at this in terms of people being primed for a certain set of ideas. And if you're not somebody who was raised to hold strong beliefs, or even if you were and you're taken in by these ideas, you're at least set along a path, right? So hey, including people in and this has gotten more and more well, it's now turned, which is kind of I think arguably, I think is the point of intersectionality, but is, hey, include people who aren't normally included, right? That sounds like a pretty good idea. You know, make sure you don't judge people by the way they look. You should get to know them as a person. That's a pretty good idea, isn't it? That's just what leftism is, right? That's just what a good person does. Is, you know, it's like that, right? That's what most people are raised to think, especially if it's reinforced by growing up in a generally like a blue state, right? It's like the Republicans are those other people, right? The conservatives, the religious, those are those other people. We're the enlightened city folk who are agnostic or atheistic, but we're probably also into astrology because that's kind of cool. And I'm going to look into being a witch because, you know, that's more, you know, that because that makes sense. These are the kinds of people who then matriculate out into the world, and a lot of them end up being, I don't know, teachers in public schools, or they end up being, and you know, we kind of know that these fields are more weaponized. We also, and another field would be human resources. Now, this is an interesting narrative I've constructed in my head. I don't really know how much it bears out in reality, but you tell me. I look at the tech companies in particular, and I see all these, you know, what's the archetype, right? The nerdy guy who comes up with a software that that makes people's lives easier, and so he becomes a billionaire overnight. And he's got all this money, and then all of a sudden he starts hearing, I don't know, maybe about 2014 or something, about his white privilege and how he needs to do something about it. And he doesn't know what to do about it, right? He's a good person. He was never a bully. He was the one beat up in school and being shoved into lockers. He doesn't want to be a bully today, even though now that he has a lot of money. So he goes out and they find people that can help them. And they say, look, the whole James Damore situation, right? These people are going out there and they're saying, these people say, like, you don't hire enough people of color. You don't hire enough minorities and oppressed classes. The guy's like, what? But I was just hiring people for the job that I had. I didn't know that I had to do this. Who can show me how to do this? Well, we're going to give you a diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist that's going to take over your HR department and help you put these processes into place. Now, that's a little story to kind of show what I see as like the progression of these things, right? Yeah. And it promulgates from, as you know, anybody who's read the most basic ideas of Yarvin knows this these from at least three places. From the media, I would include Hollywood in that. We see it in the universities, and we see it from the government, and we've seen this continual push, right? A very smart man like Obama was talking about the wage gap his entire presidency. Right. Those were the first little inroads as if you've ever chopped down a tree, right? You got to or if you chainsawed a tree, you got to start it. You got to make your wedge. You don't want to go too fast because then that tree could fall on top of your chainsaw and you could, or even worse, fall on top of you and kill you. So you got to go slowly and you got to make sure you're ready and you got to make sure it's going to fall in the direction you want. Well, I think we can look at American society as one big tree. And I don't think it's overstating my point to say, since 2016, but especially since 2020, we have been living in the midst of a soft cultural revolution, right? We have seen that more. Again, we've seen in time after time again, in that the corporation, all the pride flags at the beginning of June. We've seen all these corporations adopting this ethos, this ideology, what I would argue is a religion of a kind. It's a secular religion without a clear hierarchy, but the manifestation in the people is no less than religious fervor. And so I think, and so these are the ways in which I see it manifested in our daily lives. And I think, connecting to a point you said earlier, this was something that really only your office jockeys had to worry about, right? At a big corporation, this is what you're saying. You got to watch the sexual harassment thing, they're still using scripts from the 60s, right? Those things, right? It's like you literally watch that, you're like, who would talk? And who would talk to a woman this way in the business world? Right. It just like growing up, I just recently turned 30, so I'm a 90s baby, right? Some of my first bosses were women. I've always worked with women in the workplace. Like you just kind of treat them like coworkers, but we still got to watch the compliance, right? Every single college on the university, every single college in the university out there has sexual harassment training. That really doesn't do anything to stop rape on colleges, does it? And there's a reason for that. And I think part of the reason for that is that they're pretending that everybody can equally be a rapist, when in fact, no, predators are rapists, right? It's a certain personality that becomes. And so if you think that everybody can be one, you kind of then start to think that nobody can be one because, well, we all went through the training and I'm a good person. So, and I assume the other people around me are good people. And so, you know, we don't have to worry about it. But what does that take care of? Well, that covers the institution's ass, right? Well, listen, we give sexual harassment training. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is there's a natural incentive structure that kind of manifests in all of these situations and institutions. When we're talking about the cults of DEI, when we're talking about DEI initiatives, or we're talking about ESG scores, especially with ESG, we're looking at how people are trying to place those blockers to redirect the incentive structure.
Right.
I mean, think about the Herculean tasks. This is funny. I was just thinking of this today, but think of the Herculean tasks of early humans to irrigate croplands. And we're really going to say it's going to be that difficult to change people's beliefs about something? Really? Because, you know, people managed to like divert the mightiest of rivers to create the early agrarian societies. Humans are pretty good problem solvers. So when somebody asks the question, well, how can we create a more sustainable future? And that word sustainability is loaded with leftist bullshit. They come up with something like ESG. And then they get $14 billion behind it, or whatever, BlackRock, or whatever, whichever ones are being used. And now they're going to say, hey, we're like, yeah, your credit score is nice. I'm glad that you pay your bills on time. What are you doing about the environment?
Right.
So it's like, oh, well, now I've got these extra hoops to jump through.
But does that even matter when you look at ExxonMobil has a better ESG score than Elon Musk, Tesla Corporation has? So it's like, is it really about that, or is it about your political alignment and how well you adhere to their directives?
Yeah, let's analogize that question into old medieval times, something that we might read in like King Arthur's court, right? Does it matter if the king believes in God if he pays the bishop and he pays homage to the bishop? Because it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
Like, you know, growing up, I went to Catholic school growing up, right? And, you know, like people have varying degrees of interest in the religion that they're raised in. And, you know, and I remember like when we would do presentations in theology class, and there were the people, you know, there were the nerds like me who were like, who gave it the old try and like really researched stuff. And then there were the people who kind of just were phoning it in, right? They found the words that they needed to say. They said those words, and then they got a C. That's the school system. I can remember distinctly in like one of those developmental classes universities have, which are supposed to be like interdisciplinary. So you're with people from a lot of other majors, right? And it was about science. And I remember seeing that same kind of thing when people would give presentations. So whereas myself, the naturally curious, are like, I have in that class, I can recall doing a presentation about how poaching is encouraged by the fact that like if you don't own rhinos, right? Actually, private ownership of rhinos has actually decreased poaching. You can actually safely harvest the tusks of rhinos. So the prohibition on ivory sales is actually hurting populations. Hunting rhinos is actually helpful because the males control a large territory, but they become sterile in their old age. So anyway, so I'm like, oh, let me go out and try and prove something with science that's against the commonly held beliefs, because this was right around the time that Cecil the lion got killed, right? So I'm like, oh, let me talk about why trophy hunting, actually there's an economic incentive here that's beneficial. Right. And then there was the other guy and the other team in class that I was like, it's just like, climate change is a threat to the earth, and if we don't get better, we're all gonna die. Right? He didn't care. He wasn't there. He wasn't there to learn in that class. He wasn't trying to give it his all. Right? He's at university because he's probably on like a soccer scholarship or something like that, and it's because it's what he was told he was supposed to do. Just like I was told I was supposed to go to university.
Right.
So my point to that is the prevalency of true believer is always irrelevant. What matters is compliance. Right? What matters is people kissing the ring.
Right.
The deference to the authority and the power of another institution. So if myself as a venture capitalist, and there's a lot of these out there probably who hold nominally conservative fiscal ideas, right? And they probably like to go out and spend their money and they like to go out and have a nice dinner or having a good time on the town every once in a while, but they don't think the government should be spending money like crazy. When they're up for a loan and they have to comply with an ESG score, what are they left to do with, right? What else can they do but comply?
Right.
Because because those people have no real power they have no real control at upstream, right? They have no control at the top where the money is being distributed.
Yeah.
And sorry, one more point before we move on. And it also isn't it kind of interesting that the leftists drove people out of college that wanted to just go into business, right? We might say, again, just kind of create a simple narrative here, right? If you've got a business mind, like you kind of said, I have a business mind at the beginning, like you don't need to go. Why are you going to spend time in the university, right? Why are you going to spend time in these institutions? Well, now these institutions are the ones writing the rules for the people downstream, right? So it all comes back around again in that regard. I think a lot of us, whatever you might call us, the people against these ideas, a lot of us were caught unawares because we didn't quite realize just how unprotected our flank was.
Yeah. That's for sure. I was talking to Monica Perez the other day, and you made me think about this, and she was saying that ESG is just something to for the corporations to abide by, and I said no, ESG has nothing to do with corporations. It's about you. And she was like, what do you mean? I was like, you're already in the habit of buying from these corporations. So when these corporations make huge cultural shifts, you are going to follow them by habit of buying from them.
And maybe this makes. Can I interrupt you for a second? And maybe
not Monica. I'm
maybe
just saying
not
the
you.
General you.
And, I mean, me a little bit, but exactly that. The general you. The person who hasn't even the person who didn't even realize that the box in the corner was Pandora's box that they could open into this world of ideas and discovery. That person is just going to follow. That person's just going to follow what they see other people doing.
Right. Well, and I'm still in a bad habit of using Amazon. I know better, but it's so easy. I mean, to fill up that shelf, it's so much easier to go through Amazon,
Yeah,
and so,
it is.
And so I'm in a bad habit of that. I have made an effort to buy books and stuff in other places, but this kind of brings me to another point. I see Vivek Ramaswamy, Peter Thiel working together, and Peter Thiel's behind a lot of these like kind of deals you see going on. So Vivek Ramaswamy, with funding from Peter Thiel, started a financial institution the whole purpose was to compete with BlackRock, called Strive. I'm just wondering, like, we're watching this kind of parallel system begin to bloom, right? We see with Rumble v YouTube kind of deal, and Rumble's kind of holding their own, and that's Peter Thiel with a bunch of other guys. He's like behind a lot of these projects. And I'm just sitting here thinking, I'm like, can that idea win, or are we watching two completely separate countries being formed as we speak? Well, and I'm not talking about through borders. I mean, because of the internet age, I don't even know if having borders is necessary on a geographic scale, right?
Well, I think you just opened up the door to an incredible segue, which is like, what's actually happening next? Because most people aren't even aware of it. Most people aren't even going to care about it when it actually happens. You just say it now and you sound crazy, right?
Yeah. Well, that's how it always is, right?
I think I've talked. Well, yeah, that's it is how it always is. I think we've talked about it on your show. I think that's
by design. I would just, I don't know.
Well, I think there's a real there are those of us who want to be. All right, if you're in traffic, right, and you're in a small car behind a bunch of people, you have no idea what's going on. And you're not going to really know until you get to the front and see whatever accident or whatever happened up there that's actually causing the jam.
Right.
But when you're the person in the semi, or when you're in the person in the lifted truck or a van, and you can actually peer over all the other cars, you can see, in a sense, into your future.
Right.
Because you're going to see where you're going to be pretty quickly. And I think there have always been those of us within, societies who have tried to peer as forward as we can. And that's why sometimes things sound crazy when you say it, because you don't really see it until it happens, right? And a lot of people got a healthy dosing of that in 2020. And that's one of the and that caused a lot of people to freak out because of it, right? Because, by the way, being woken up and opening Pandora's box, if you remember that story, it doesn't really start out great. When you open up Pandora's box, that's what actually releases, war, pestilence, and what was the third one? Death into the world, right? So it's actually not. It's actually kind of a dangerous thing to even see what's coming next. This is all a lead up to say, what is this a lead up to say? Peering into the future. That's where we are. We were talking about ESG. Where did I start with this? Sorry, this is bad podcasting.
No, that's all right.
No,
we were talking about
Peter Thiel.
Yeah.
I got back with it. So with Peter Thiel. So that's the question everybody's asking. And so here's one way that I'll answer it. I think if we look at the West, there were when socialism reared its ugly head on mankind, right? At the height of capitalist success, the socialist reared its ugly head. We saw three dominant forms. We saw three dominant forms. I've used this narrative a few times. Some people like it, some people don't. I'm happy to get into it as much as possible. We saw international socialism in the communists. We saw national socialism of the fascists, and then we saw the corporate socialism of the progressives. Right. And we know, in fact, that the progressives, one of the reasons why they chose that name and why they took a different approach was because they didn't think Americans were quite ready for those kinds of ideas. So little by little, they try to shape the population over a century to fit what is, again, for most people, socialism is caring. But it incorporated this other element, which was a respect for and a desire for corporations. National socialism had this as well, right? International socialism was the only one who did it.
Right.
But this respect for corporations, and in fact, preference and deference to corporations. So, insofar as what comes next, I've said I'm on. This is one of the things I'm saying. By 2030, it's going to matter more who you work for than whatever government you swore allegiance to that you thought that you participated in. We're watching the actual governing powers being outsourced to the corporations, right? And in fact, people are challenging this in court and saying institutions like Facebook are acting like state actors, and the state is saying, well, it's not like we wrote them a letter, right? That's a pretty nice formal distinction to make, isn't it? Right? People who have read their Burnham understand the distinction to make between formalism and informalism.
Right.
When we follow the money, watch how the power flows, we see more and more that these sorts of initiatives that have real power, that because they've become people's moral center, they're being pushed onto increasingly average people. And by extension, people who disagree with that moral center.
Okay. So you said something I want to ask you about, because I think I have a different timeline than you do. And I want to kind of pick your brain on it. When you're talking about the international communism, or the international socialism, the national socialism, and the progressivism, right? All right. It's my understanding that communism started in the early 20th century. Like, I don't know when I don't know when Marx was that 1908, 1910, something like that? Yep. When was he right? Yeah. Okay. Progressivism,
I think in the 1880s as well, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So progressivism, really kind of, you had the progressive era in the 1920s, right? Nazism or fascism wasn't really taking hold until the late 1930s. So I'd always kind of calculated in my mind, in the way that, and looking at the influences, and I did a podcast on this a couple of years ago. I can't remember the guy's name, but there was a political theorist that the progressives the communists and the Nazis all get gathered around. And if you read his ideas, you could kind of see where they were branching off of.
Yeah.
I got the idea through reading and research that fascism was a combination. It was like if you were to take your favorite parts of communism and your favorite parts of progressivism and put them together, you would come up with fascism, right? And that was kind of like the idea that I had. But you're saying they all kind of are brothers or sisters or siblings.
I think they all spring
came
from
up
the
together.
they all spring from the same well. Well, I think you're right, and I will say oftentimes, because I'm so focused on ideas, I'll lose some of that historical accuracy when I'm trying to like paint a picture.
Okay.
What I would say as well is that a lot of these were all influenced by the same kinds of people.
Right.
Yes. So like that, so they have
Totally.
there's many jumping off points as far as that goes, right? Most of the early progressives were trained in Germany. So we see the German historicism and romanticism, and you have Kant and all those people. Anyway, so like then the Germans were considered like the philosophical center of the world for the longest time. Still to this day, there's a large, and we have a large German population in the U.S. too. So I guess that probably makes sense why so many people are taken in by those ideas. To my point, I'm more painting a vignette looking back with 100 years behind us, as opposed to doing an accurate historical analysis, because I think my point, where my point still stands, is that the corporate progressive model of the United States is the one that won the century, right? And now what do we see again? But we see that same narrative of oppressor oppressed throughout all of them, right? They all kind of share these different commonalities. And I mean, and again, to the point is that now we've even seen we also know that a lot of the intellectuals who were communists kind of all follow in the same thought process now, right? You don't go and you necessarily study Marxism now. You're going to go and study critical theory,
right?
Which has the same exact presuppositions.
Yes.
So they call themselves something different, but they all spring from the same well. And what's been interesting is to watch. Well, what's been interesting is basically, as I think also just kind of reached the end of this monetary experiment that we've all been going through over the last 100 years as well, and especially since getting off the gold standard, that's actually a signal for why they need the new moral center, in a sense, because people can't follow the money anymore because the money is not real.
It's the most libertarian thing I've ever heard you say.
I mean, hey, I was in.
Truth is truth. Honestly,
I don't know. It's what who had the best thing to say about that, and it was funny because it was kind of like definitely a starting the clock moment. Was Curtis Yarvin's first appearance on You're Welcome with Michael Malice, where he said libertarianism is a cult. Learn everything you can from them and then move on. I never really thought I would move on, and I don't. But yet here I am, being the guy that wrote about the post-libertarian moment, and I think. Right. But I think a lot of that has to do with precisely what we're seeing, right? I talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion as these are the highest regards for liberalism, because liberalism is just this repeat. Okay, there's something on the margin. We're going to try and center that again. Okay, so I keep talking about a moral center, so I'm saying literally conceptualize society as a circle. Right.
We're going to get to the morality here in a second, because this is like where I want to go with this conversation. But you go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I mean, but this is the basic libertarian idea, right? As long as we can agree on these certain basic things, then morality doesn't really matter. You can have a different moral structure than I can, and I think what we're all faced with, anybody who was studying these ideas has to be faced with the fact that that's not true. Because in fact, when we saw that liberty was a threat, even many good libertarians bowed the knee to power.
Yeah.
Right. And we've now seen, and the landscape looks completely different. Institutions that I would have looked to for analysis, I now don't even want to go visit because they're doing such bad analysis on things.
Except for the libertarianinstitute.org. That's the libertarianinstitute.org. Oh, sorry.
No, but Libertarian Institute puts it out. They got many good works. Mises is another one. But again, we're seeing this we're seeing the separation between.
But yeah, you're talking like Reason, Cato, like these kind of beltway kind of
Beltway and what corporate, right? Because they they want, and I forget if you, hopefully you remember who said it, but the whole idea of they want progressive ends by libertarian means. Well, somebody actually wrote a book about that. I don't know if y'all are familiar. His name is Cass Sunstein, and he called what he did. He called his whole idea of his whole concept was based on a libertarian framework.
Right.
Because so I can't even remember the name of what he talked. I literally can't remember, but I know one of the things was opting out versus opting in. So in the past, you had to opt into like a 401k system.
I remember hearing about his book.
Yeah, Cass, it's his major book. If you Google it right now, it'll pop up, I'm sure.
I'm getting it right now.
Yeah. But like, so basically what he kind of studies these different things, and he says, well, look, we know that all these like economic policies and procedures would benefit people, like starting a 401k early, right? Everybody knows that the more you invest, as long as the system survives, you're going to have plenty when you retire. So the story goes. And he said, well, how do we get more people to invest in 401ks?
Is that how change happens?
I think how change happens is one of them, but he's got, libertarian paternalism. There we go. That is what he calls his model, is libertarian paternalism.
Oh, I don't see that one, but okay.
And so I don't think that's the name of a book. I think that's the theory inside of his book.
Oh, okay.
And it's inside of that. I think it's inside of how change happens.
Okay.
But he calls it a libertarian paternalism. So he's fusing the progressive concept of paternalism that we have with a libertarian framework. Turns out they're actually compatible. So now we see it. So now again, we're looking at what? Well, it's not economics that actually separate that are actually separating these different groups and visions for the world, right? Outside of just the basic Machiavellian structure. And that's again, and so again, what do we see? Well, we see a culture that's been, we see a culture that praises atheism. Well, that's not good enough, right? Because again, you need to give somebody something to believe in. Well, that's what the critical theories, the women's studies, the race studies, the critical gender theories studies, the queer studies have provided for people, because it takes that liberal ethos of, well, hey, we need to center the oppressed. We did it with women, that worked out okay. We did it with blacks in America, that worked out pretty well for them and for everybody. And it's like, so let's just keep doing it. And now where are we? Right now we're at the sense of if one day a coworker of yours walks into the office and says, "Don't call me Roger, call me Rhonda," you can't ask how you chose the name Rhonda. Want to know how I know that? I recently saw a training at a major corporation that had exactly that scenario in it, because a friend and listener of my show sent it to me.
Jesus. All right, so let's get into this deep shit, because this is really where I want to go with you. You're a faithful Catholic, raised Catholic. You're
currently not practicing, but I consider myself a man of deep faith, so I don't want to misrepresent myself to people.
Okay. Well, I know you do some podcasts with Andrew and y'all. Mm-hmm. All right.
I consider myself a Catholic. I'm just not a very good Catholic. So, okay. but I've never turned my back on God.
Right. Okay. I have. All right. And it was seeing the environment around us and putting pieces together in my own head from lessons I learned as a child, that I started saying, okay, wait a second. All this looks way too familiar. And at the same time, I'm reading the works of the elites, right? So I'm reading like Klaus Schwab, I'm reading Carol Quigley, I'm reading this stuff from like the 40s and H.G. Wells, and this is where I'm going to go with this. So H.G. Wells is known for his fiction work, but he's not as well known for his nonfiction work. But his nonfiction work is the basis of all his fiction work. So basically, he comes up with these theories or these ideas, these blueprints for the future, and he writes these nonfiction essays, and then he wrote books based upon these ideas that he had. And there's a book called The Open Conspiracy, and it's kind of like a prequel to his book New World Order. But in The Open Conspiracy, he blatantly states what we must do is we must rob religion of mysticism And we must replace that mysticism with materialism and science in order for everybody to be focused on the same end goal, and therefore create a one world religion, right? You had mentioned earlier that DEI is deist.
Yeah.
Right?
It's literally the root of like God.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Then you gave an analogy, and I don't know if you realized what you were doing when you gave the analogy, but you're talking about sitting in traffic and sitting in a tractor trailer looking above all the traffic so you can see what's going on ahead of you. Maybe think of the mountain of God. You go, you climb the mountain so that you can see, right?
Right.
Lucifer brought Jesus up onto the pinnacle so that he could see all the nations, right? Yep. You go up so that you can see. So DEI is like a Tower of Babel. And then people like you and I are trying to figure out how to climb the mountain of God to combat that tower. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. So it's this, there's this thing happening. It goes back to the parallel economies. It's this thing happening simultaneously where people that are seeing what is happening in the world and recognize these patterns that are taking place, that they're backing up and they're turning back to a more traditional route because they understand that more traditional route offered them the honest path. Right. And so I want you to get into this a little bit, because I think when I talked to Buck about this stuff a couple of months ago, he brought it up on the show. We didn't dive deep into it, but he said there's powers and principalities. And when I look at like the transgender movement, right, that's like, to me, as I look at it, it's the most egregious denial of God. It's like, what you made was so bad, I'm going to have to remake it in my image. Like your image isn't good enough. I have to remake it because it's you, because you are not my God. I am my God.
So one of the earliest, so let's start here. As far as I understand it, one of the earliest gender theorists was Simone de Beauvoir, who was a student of Sartre. People might have heard of him.
How do you spell that? I'm sorry.
Sartre, Sartre. And then Simone de Beauvoir is, I'll send it to you. I'm not going to try and spell it.
I got Simone de, and then
Bouvier, I think.
Okay.
Now here's where it connects to what you just said. Existential part of Sartre's reasoning for why God can't exist is because all created things have a purpose, and yet humans seem to be this creature that can create their own purpose, right? Existentialism, that's one of the umbrellas of existentialism that exists, is that there might not be an overarching metaphysical truth, but we can create our own purpose. And so what Sartre talks about when he's discussing this is, again, so a pen is created to write, right? A computer is created to do a million things, right? He didn't have that at the time. But like a pen is created to write, an axe is created to cut. A book is created to be read. Well, since human beings have no intrinsic purpose, how can we say that we have a creator? And moreover, if we create things and say we're creators of things, how can we say that we have a creator? Well, so as again, I'm pretty sure this is accurate, but Simone de Beauvoir, his student, then made analogies to this in terms of sex roles and gender roles, right? And gender is just the romantic version of sex, right? Like in English, we have a lot of these dual meanings that come to us from different like linguistic tracks,
right?
And
right.
So what people do is they capitalize on that in the modern day to pretend that there's something different, right? That's like the trick. That's like the trick that's being played. But what she did was she talked about how like women could become like men, right? We had that week, and that then was that, as far as I understand it, was the influence for some of the early experiments in transgenderism, that were done. And I can't remember the name of the doctor, but it was there was a boy, there were two boys that were born, and then there was an accident during the circumcision.
I remember hearing about. Yep.
This is one of the most well-known cases for this. And so what this doctor tried to do were all these horrific things to try and raise this boy as a girl. But then his entire life, he kind of knew something was off. And the way the story goes, both the twins ended up killing themselves because of the trauma that they suffered at the hands of that monster. But that's the basis on which we say that children today can get quote unquote gender affirming care.
Yeah.
I mean, you can, there's a lot of other gobbledygook in between there and here, but it does start from this, I don't want to, I'm going to belabor the point here for a second. I'm not really talking about people who are struggling with gender dysphoria, right? This is about what people can do with people who struggle from gender dysphoria. Right. They can capitalize on that.
It's like a modern day MK Ultra experiment.
Sure. And what a lot of those people believe is that there is no intrinsic nature to humanity, that we are basically clay that can be put into many different forms. Thomas Sowell talks about this in terms of the constrained and unconstrained vision of man. We see this, and we see this sort of back and forth throughout historical time periods as well, right? So what you see then are people who, by rejecting a creator who says, which is to say we have no purpose, means we can do whatever we want, really, doesn't it? And that opens up the door for the most Machiavellian among us, right? The most pathological humans among us, to take over, in a sense. Right. Whereas before they kind of, maybe they had to, maybe you had corrupt bishops throughout history, right? But that person had to climb a lot, had to climb a lot to get to that position of bishop. Right. And that person had to at least give a pretense towards the Christian ethos and the Christian morality. Right. Even if they didn't believe it, they at least had to kind of bow to that. Well, who do the people in these NGOs, the Carl Schwabs of the world, who do they bow to? Sure isn't the God of Abraham.
Right.
Right. I mean, like this is the funny part. It's kind of like
they bow to power. It's really what they bow to.
Right. Exactly. So, and that's at
least on the surface. I mean, I don't know what they're doing.
Right.
At Bohemian Grove.
but what you strike on is an interesting point, which is like, okay, the God of power. And then it's like, well, as Christians especially have a tough time, right? Because we believe in the one true God, of acknowledging that, well, maybe there's other things out there, which is something that like the early Hebrews, like, the early Christians would have believed and would have seen, is that of course Baal exists, right? Of course, these other spirits or metaphysical forces have an impact on the world. This is just the most powerful one, and this is the true one.
Right.
Well, and that's, and again, we see this in the French Revolution with like or in the fall of the French, with like the practice of black mass and stuff like that. And it's no mistake, I think, that a lot of these people use satanic imagery as well, right? Because you might say that guy, because what does Lucifer offer Jesus? He offers him the world, and what does he ask? Well, he asks for his allegiance. I mean, this is where the scary thing is, where as we start to peel back, we just started talking about DEI and corporate culture here, right? Now we're talking about Lucifer and Satan and God. It's like, that's a lot for people to take in, because they've been brought up in the world of H.G. Wells, which says materialism and science are the only truth you need to understand the world.
Right.
Exactly. But if you can have a religious belief, but you don't get to talk about that, not unless you're Muslim, right? And that's just because we want to stick it in the face of Americans who sent their brothers and sisters to die in their country to begin with.
Well, your religious belief has to be able to be explained by materialism. If it can't be explained materialistically, then it can't be real.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this whole ortho bros and Catholic, whatever, that I really don't care about, but that's part of what attracted me to Orthodox Christianity, is because there's explanations for things that are inexplicable through materialism, right? Like, so experiences I've had in my life, like things I've seen, things I've witnessed, I can therefore there's an undergirding, there's a foundation for explaining where that came from. And I've never found that anywhere else. And so as I started witnessing, I mean, one of the first, I think it was like the first text I sent in March of 2020, as soon as COVID hit, I texted Pete and I was like, this reminds me of Revelation. You know, like,
yeah, a lot of people are
making
those,
like,
right?
That was the first thought that pops in my head. And Pete goes, yeah, you're not wrong. And I was like, okay, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't crazy, you know?
Yeah, right.
You know? And so, and so I look at it, and you brought up a point a while ago where you're like, yeah, obviously Bail existed. There's that meme. Have you seen that? Have you seen that?
That's what I based it off of, Jonathan Bagumi. Yeah.
Where's Peterson? How it started? Peterson, clean your room. How it's going? Jonathan Pajot. Of course, Thor exists.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, yeah. All right. So there's another element to the trans, even the gay LGBTQ agenda altogether that I see, and it's a thread that I like to pull on every once in a while. And I think this would be interesting to hear your thoughts on this.
Okay.
When I look at this, what I see is eugenics. And what I see is after the whole fiasco of sterilizing mentally ill children that lasted into the 70s. I believe it started in the 20s, lasted up into the 70s in Indiana. I believe was the last state to make it illegal to sterilize the mentally ill.
Yep.
Now we've seen like other countries. I think it was it Iceland that was offering
Down syndrome.
Yes, exactly. That's what
children with Down syndrome. They were they basically don't exist. I think so.
I think it was Iceland. It's one of those European countries that are predominantly white, progressive.
Yeah, they have almost no Down syndrome citizens because they basically just abort them almost immediately.
Yeah, as soon as they'll run specific tests and they
identify. It is one of the, my understanding is it's one of the only defect, you know, if you want to call it a defect, it's one of the only defects you can test for in utero. Other things like autism and other developmental disorders, they're developmental disorders, right? So it's something that happens like in the early stages of life, whereas because it's a chromosomal difference with people with Down syndrome, you can actually see that as soon as the baby is a baby.
Okay.
Right. As soon as that's my understanding. There's a
but this has been going on for years. You know, so I see this and it's like, okay, instead of involuntarily sterilizing, you've gotten parents to voluntarily sterilize their children by putting them through these procedures and giving them the puberty blockers and this, that, and the other. You've convinced people to engage in sexual immorality so that they will not populate. So you've taken the eugenics movement and you've made it a libertarian movement.
Yeah, it's libertarian. It's paternalist. It's because progressivism has always had this paternalist element. Let's substitute that word for a second to something anybody, you know, that everybody can understand, which is like husbandry, right? The practice of animal husbandry is like innate to humans. Again, going back to the fact that we were able to irrigate, you know, rivers thousands of years ago, we were also able to domesticate different animals by those same means.
Right.
So who's to say that people aren't still trying to do that? And of course, you know, if you look at I think he does great work, but James Corbett, right? That's his name, the Corbett Report.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. I want to make sure I got his first name right. But his like 4-part documentary on like Bill Gates, the man, and is fantastic. I'd highly recommend people check it out. It really answers a lot of questions of why, you know, why it answers the questions why vaccines for me. Right. You know, in particular, right? Whatever the spiritual elements, there's then that manifestation in the material, practical world that we have to contend with.
And then there was St. Paisios in 1990s that was like, the mark of the beast is coming through vaccines from a new virus, yada, yada, yada. There was all that happening too. So it's like this element and this ability to lay out this foundation and these patterns are available for people to see and to recognize.
Well, and and the eugenics point is so important because I think if you were to take a strict historical case, you'd be like, but what are you talking about? Aren't they making these people less fit? And it's like, well, yeah, they don't really care because they're not good. They're, because as long as that's only happening to a fraction of the population, say 10%, that then the demographic projections from that write themselves.
Yeah, the eugenics movement was all about depopulation.
Anybody who wants to take over the world, right? Marx realized this. Anybody who wants to take over the world realizes pretty quickly that in order to make it last, you gotta kill at least 20% of the population.
Yeah, because there's going to be 20% that resist. So you better kill 40% just to make sure you get that 20.
Yeah. And so so they don't. I do think that this is it is sterilization by other means, and that's one of the reasons why it's so scary that they're getting them young, and it goes beyond, and it really is the border of trans, right? I don't think it's homosexuality per se, because I think there's cases of homosexuality throughout history, right? It's the connection to children.
Well, I'm looking at the commercialization of it. I'm not worried about
right.
like independent people making independent decisions, like our friend James Gentleman.
Yeah. Well, perfectly. And I think, and to the point, right? A lot of well-intentioned gay Americans were like, hey, I want tax benefits. Why can't I get tax benefits if I have a stable partner? Because that's really what people cared about, right? Yeah. Like at the end of the day, that's what people would care.
Yeah,
that's what people would talk about.
Well, and they wanted the benefits of being able to visit their loved ones in the hospital. Yeah, understandable things. Like nothing
and then what happened when gay marriage was legalized?
They take things like that and they exploit it.
And you can see this in some of the a lot of the disaffected liberal journalists who have like now migrated over to platforms like Substack. The one I'm thinking of I think her name is Katie Herzog. She's been on Tim Dillon a few times, and she's like a journalist. But I've heard her talk about this, where it was kind of like Friday we all went home realizing that we won. Gay marriage was legal, and then on Monday we were pushing for trans kids. And I don't think she said it exactly that way, but basically saying then Monday we came into the office and the marching orders were now we have to mainstream trans. Right. It's not enough for the gay and lesbian community to have some measure of social acceptance. Now we have to push the envelope even further for these people that literally break all the boundaries. And we're going to completely ignore all the arguments that we've been making for the last 30 years for gay acceptance, right? Hardware, because they made the argument that it was a hardware issue. This is how I was born. Right. That goes out the window with the modern gender ideology, which says you can be whatever you want. Right. Right. Yes. So why? And so why? Okay. Well, the average conservative will be like, see hypocrisy, but we understand as people who have studied power for long enough that hypocrisy benefits people if you're in power. Yeah, because you get to have it both ways. Yeah,
they're aiming at a specific end, and you have to understand that they're aiming at a specific end. This is all a conditioning mechanism to usher in transhumanism, right? It's because you're not a complete person until you complete yourself, however you see fit to complete yourself, whether it's a laser gun on your arm and you're playing base wars, or that's a really old game, so I don't expect anybody to get that. Or you're a chick with a dick, like whatever, complete yourself however you want to complete yourself, just figure it out. And so this all opens up to a transhumanist agenda, and it also configures right in line with Malthusianism and depopulation. And you can just go down the line of all these horrible ideals that have been like pushed upon people for millennia. And it's just like, they've just found a way to get you to comply with it. That's all they've done. And they utilize your emotions. There's no reason involved in this. It's all emotional.
Yeah. Well, and going back to, the little narrative I put together about progressivism, something that progressivism didn't have, especially at its inception, was a commitment to being right over anything else. It was there was a commitment to getting the right people in power, is what it was. Right? Listen, the capitalists, they can do whatever they want because we're going to be managers of the economy. And we're going to get the right people into those management positions, and then eventually we're going to be the ones that control the money. Right? And so and that's what they did. So it's like you can see you can see the through line. I mean, this is one of I think the most difficult things for somebody who grew up religious but a very tolerant person, and I never really one of the things that frankly annoys the heck out of me is the whole thing of like, what were the crazy Bible bangers saying before gay marriage was legalized? And
they're coming after your kids.
They're going to come after the kids next. And I know very well that's not most people. Again, going back, what did I say earlier? Most people aren't rapists. Yeah. Right? The predators are. And the predators are wolves and sheep, and what's the sign of the Fabiist? A wolf in sheep's clothing. Yeah. So what they're doing is they take these, and what form of government do we have? Largely speaking, a democracy. So we take these disenfranchised groups, not we, they take these disenfranchised groups and they offer them what? They offer them power. What do they have to sacrifice? Their genitals. That's a pretty good game for that. Humans have been sacrificing their genitals for as long as we've had them. I mean, just look at our friends, the children of Israel, right? I mean, we've even cross-dressing is not like it's a unique phenomenon to modern times, right? Cross-dressing has always existed, and in fact, there have been, and this is what people will point to without any context, but there have been societies that that embrace a different that's something outside men and women. Now, like I said, the important context is most of those are
there were like isolated. Native American tribes and stuff like that. Yeah.
Not just Native American tribes, because you see it in a lot of primitive cultures, but they're usually highly geographically remote, for one, and for two, you see pretty well before that there's atypical breeding patterns, which is to say the population between men and women are offset from each other. So there's more women. So like there's one I remember, and I think it's in like Cambodia or Laos or something like that, where it's a mountain community that has a practice of bigamy, but it's one wife to two men, and oftentimes those men are brothers. And like that's kind of weird. It kind of sticks out, but it's because they didn't have enough women being born, and so they had to create this practice to compensate from it. Right. We don't have that problem in the modern day. Right. So what we're doing, so that's where it again points to whatever's happening right now in terms of gender ideology is far more an effort of husbandry than it is of actual wants and desires, because we just don't see that represented in human history.
I remember hearing there was a Joe Rogan podcast, and he was talking to this guy. I can't remember the guy's name. I can see his face, but I can't remember his name. So the guy was going over to Africa, and he was working with the pygmies, and he was teaching the pygmies how to dig wells. Right. Guy used to be a UFC fighter, Justin Wren. I want to say his name was. I think that's right, Justin Wren. I'm going to stick with that for right now. Anyway, so he was going over to Africa. He was helping him dig wells, and he had suffered through a lot of depression. And he was telling these Africans that live in the tribal communities about wanting to commit suicide. And they looked at him like he was cross-eyed. They were just like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Like, and there's something to be said about people that struggle every day just to survive, and the way that they appreciate life compared to the comforts that we have secured here in the West, especially in America. And it allows us the benefit of creating a lot of problems that don't really exist. And that's what I see a lot of what's going on. It's, you have the it's almost like you had to over medicate the population so that they had problems, so that there was something that you could fix for them. And I just wonder how much of this is spiritual versus how much of it is actual, like an actual like human condition. Because it's like what H.G. Wells was talking about. We not only replaced the mystical with the material in the church, but we replaced anything spiritual in our lives with the material.
Right.
And it's not made any of us any more happy than we were the day before. And I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that. I just felt like that was kind of a offshoot of what you were saying.
Well, what I think is, so what does it mean to demystify something, right? Like that means to take it means to remove the mystery, which is to say that you have all the answers, right? So what does our modern medical system say? We have all the answers. Take this pill, you're going to feel better. Ignore the side effects, but you're going to feel better. Right?
Forget that 4-hour erection. I know you were just trying to get rid of that rash on your arm, but you go hire a prostitute. You'll be all right.
Right. And how does that happen? Well, a lot of good intentioned people go out there and they try to solve a problem, but they don't necessarily, but who's to say that they're asking the right question?
Yeah.
Right. And Western, the Western system in particular has kind of taken this. So how do we connect this to the guy who was telling pygmies about being depressed and wanting to commit suicide and then being like, what's your problem, dude? You're an alien with 4 heads. It's like, well, okay. It's like, because what? So what happens when I'm faced with an existential crisis? What does my culture say? Well, you're depressed, you're anxious, you're this, you're that, you have these malformities. So we can fix those. Don't worry. What happens when you're in I'm assuming I wasn't obviously raised in one, but I'm raised in a family, it's like, what happens in a tight community that has a common belief structure? Yeah. You might not even reach that existential crisis because
you have too much responsibility. Yeah.
Well, and you know what your purpose is going to be.
Right. Yes.
And in a world where you tell people they can be whatever they want to be, some people love that. And I think a lot more people get completely terrified by that. And I think a lot of people then in turn, if they've been told everything they want to be, and then what do I end up as? If I don't end up a star, then that means I've failed. Right. So I think what I'm trying to draw out to your point is when if you believe in a demystified world, then that means there must be something wrong with you if things aren't going your way.
Right.
Or that means there must be something wrong with there was something wrong with you because you're not seeing the demystified world. When what religious people and spiritual people have always known is that of course there's mystery in the world. And by the way, even the most astute scientist would recognize this too, right? The true scientist recognizes the mystery of the world because they're trying to uncover it.
Right.
Which is completely different from the scientism, the religious belief structure that's given to the masses through media institutions.
This seems like one of those bell curve memes that we're like talking about now.
Yep.
Yeah. It's like that. That middle range. It's like, no, like I know everything and now I'm going to be depressed. And you got the really like stupid redneck inbred dude going, I don't know, it's a mystery. And you got the real smart guy going, I don't know, it's a mystery. And
yep. Yeah. But
it takes something. There's a certain amount of humility that's missing in this world too. It's like, nobody's willing to just be like, yeah, I don't know. There's a lack of meaning, but there's also a lack of humility. And everybody has to be right. And that's something I struggle with every day when I'm listening to people talk and they're so sure of themselves. And I'm like, yeah, are you positive? Like, what, like, how much would you put on this? What would you bet on this?
Right.
Being the correct answer. Would you sacrifice your mom's life? Like, what are you willing to gamble that
Mhm.
you are correct. And the more I think about things that way, the less I'm likely to tell you I'm absolutely positive about anything. It's like I can tell you what I'm witnessing, what I'm seeing, how I observe it, where I'm coming from, my point of view, the way that I am guarding myself against whatever possibility of deconstruction that may be coming forward to me. But I can't tell you positively that I know anything. And it's unsettling to get to this point, but it's also kind of like relaxing because I don't feel like I'm carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders.
Right. And why should you? That's not your role.
Well,
It's really not. That's really none of our roles, right? So why do we put the weight of the world on our shoulders? I think in part because our society, or the broader culture, if you will, it kind of says that you have to put the weight of the world on your shoulders because you have your own world.
Well, yeah, because you're supposed to be able to solve your own problems because all the mystery's taken out of it.
Yeah.
Right. There's nothing else to turn to. It's you or nothing. Right.
The existentialism point. We are beings who create. Therefore, we can have no creator.
Right.
So then people at this point, your average atheist believes that. And so who do they turn to in times, it's funny. Just let it be just popped into my head, right? When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me.
Yeah.
Speaking words of wisdom, let it be. The atheist doesn't have that. Right. So what do they have to replace it with? Well, they kind of have to replace it with something, would be my contention, which is why new atheism never went anywhere and why communism was such an abject failure. It's because because your faith has to go somewhere. And so it can go into a man, it can go into an institution, it can go into God, or it could go into maybe something that's not quite God, but still has some kind of power, especially if enough people start believing in it.
Yeah.
Going back to this concept of the reverse engineered religion, you start to put enough things that people hold in high esteem together in such a combination, diversity, equity, inclusion, in this instance, as far as our conversations are concerned, now you've given something for people to believe in again.
Yeah. And if you don't believe in any of those things, that's when you turn to drugs, alcohol, and all that stuff. It's when it seems like every institution, every man, every woman has let you down and you don't believe in a creator, you just turn to substance. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're right. And so you look for the quick fix. You take a fast life strategy. Right. Because that's what humans have always done.
Yep.
There's this I've got a few pieces that I'm working on. I recently published one about how Salman Rushdie saved liberalism. Because after
I haven't read it yet. I saw it. It's in my email, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna read it. Yeah, but I know how you are, and I'm like, man, this is gonna be a subject.
Well, what I kind of do is I kind of talk about, and the piece I'm talking about, if you weren't careful, right? If you weren't a subscriber at beenawake.com with your email address and to get all that good information, that better sense making we put out there.
You're not a friend of mine.
You might. Well, thank you. But you might be mistaken when you saw people like Joe Biden talking about freedom of expression and why that's such an important thing, right? And what I'm was pointing to in that piece is how there's still this huge segment of the American population, specifically American voting blocks who vote Democrat, who are so insulated from the war of culture and the war of ideas that is raging about them. They are so isolated from it that they had somebody like Salman Rushdie speak at an event, and they clearly did no security. They clearly had no security. Salman Rushdie's people didn't think for a second to have extra security. Any moderate right-winger conservative who comes to any kind of prominence immediately starts investing millions of dollars in private security because they have no choice.
Right.
So why isn't this happen? So it's kind of like it's obvious it's a bit of a misdirect, the headline, but it's just kind of saying it's like, no, in 2 months these politicians are going to be calling for the censorship of their opponents in the name of safety. But today, they're going to laud the romantic notion of freedom of expression, right? Because free speech, because we all know free speech, though, otherwise is a right-wing talking point.
Yep.
And so I encourage people to go read the piece, and it's nice. I think it's something nice to chew on, is what it is. And if you read something that might make it seem like I'm a normie, just know that you got to write for an audience, and you want people to come into your camp. You don't want to be excluding people. If I was interested in excluding people from my camp, I would still be a libertarian.
Well, man, I think we've covered a lot here. My brain's starting to hurt.
Yeah, mine too, a little bit.
You have any last words you want to put out there before you throw out your plugs?
No, I'll just go ahead and plug. If you guys haven't already, please visit beenawake.com. That's the home for my Substack. Been Awake is where you can go to find news, philosophy, mindset, and what comes next in politics. You can find me on all social media at the LB Muniz. That's Muniz for the gringos out there.
I'll put links. It'll all be there. I'm going to stop this recording.
You wanna be a hero, instead you're just a slave. All your good intentions took you to your grave. Your pride is how they killed you. With the flag you wave just like a fool. They promised you a mountain, gifted you a stone. They demanded that you throw it into your neighbor's home, and then seize all that they worked for and give it to the throne just like a tool. Well, as we all just stand in line and glorify new ways of being cruel, it seems to me humanity is not something that they're teaching us in school. They dumbs down all around, propaganda, their pollution. They set a cage up on the stage, a facade for all solution. They build a wall, block them all from this mental institution. It's insane. Now they're writing their own rule books and they're crossing all their T's. They're fashioning their people to all wear beggars' knees. If you want a clean drink of water, well, you must say pretty please. It's all a game. As we all just stand in line and justify these crimes done in our names, it seems to me authority and tyranny are both one and the same. Well, it's time to change the channel. It's time to set things right. Make them all rot with fear in their beds at night. Devour all their worthless souls and sacrificial right, just like we should. Of those who are to blame, and we'll stack them up like cordwood, watch them sizzle on the flames for good. Well, as we all just stand in line waiting for some kind of Robin Hood, our liberty will never be until our right to freedom is understood. Thank you.